Follow the light.
नूर की जानिब.
光に従って Sigue la luz.
Sarilanitzua.
Folge dem Licht.
跟随光，
Ikuti Cahaya.
自理力行。
دنبال کردن نور.
نور کی جانب.
Why did Christianity decline in the West? What is the Christian response to other faiths in the 21st century? How does the Eastern Church help to revive Christian faith in the Western pluralistic context? Welcome to the Light from the East show. It's our great honor that today we have Dr. Dudley Woodberry, a seasoned scholar, a profound researcher, and a teacher. He's a Dean Emeritus at School of Intercultural Studies and a senior professor of Islamic Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. Welcome to the show, Dr. Woodberry.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Dr. Woodberry, since 1953, you are writing and preaching and teaching and traveling and engaging with our Muslim friends. What's your recent you are working and what's your published work here? We would like to know that. It's a huge work. I know it's not possible to cover, but would you introduce some of your work to us?
All right. The first book here is one that was edited by Evelyn Rezache called Toward Respectful Understanding and Witness Among Muslims. And it has a complete bibliography of my work up through 2011. So I won't mention the details beyond that. And then a book that has had a very big influence today, and it represents the work really of thousands of people and a large number of mission agencies. I just had the privilege of putting it together. It's called From Seed to Fruit, Global Trends, Fruitful Practices, and Emerging Issues Among Muslims. What happened here is people involved with Muslims, Christians, worked over 3 years to do research. And then we all gathered together in a conference in Southeast Asia, and we looked at what God was blessing. And so one of the articles here, particularly in the revised edition of 2011, goes through 10 ways that God is particularly blessing in reaching Muslims. One of them, for example, is getting a group of Muslims where they trust each other and looking in the Bible at the stories about the people that the Quran mentions but does not describe. And then you look at those and see, how should I change my life as a result? And when you've gone through the whole Old Testament with the chief characters there that the Quran mentions, it then leads to Jesus, who the Quran also mentions. And they're ready, in many cases, to accept him. Here is Muslims and Christians on the Emmaus Road. This represented a large group of Christians working among Muslims gathering in Holland. And what we did is to see what God was doing and what God was blessing, but we fitted it into the story of the Emmaus Road, and each section is headed by a phrase from the New Testament account. And by saying Muslims and Christians on the Emmaus Road, the Muslims come to realize who he is. But it is done in that very gracious way or an attempt to follow the pattern of Jesus in doing that. And then once 9/11 came along, there was a lot of interest among Muslims in forming peace with Christians. And so Muslim and Christian reflections on peace, divine and human dimensions. This we did with a Muslim seminary in Samsun, Turkey, which is the town that Ataturk came from before he came down and led his revolution in the 1920s. But here we gathered together to see what is there that is common in our traditions or that we can use for peacemaking. And then we wanted our students to have an opportunity to be publishing as well. And so resources for peacemaking in Muslim and Christian relations. This is done, I did the introduction to it, but the articles are all done by students who worked particularly on the countries they were familiar with, the countries from which they came, and looked at what were resources for peacemaking there.
Dr. Woodbery, I recently read your article in Fuller Theological Seminary magazine, and there was a fascinating story about a chair of professors in historical Islamic University, Jamiat al-Zahar in Cairo, Egypt. And I have read that there is also inside this book as well. Can you explain us a little bit more about that chair in Jamiat al-Zahar?
What I did in this book was to describe a chair at Al-Azhar University where what happened over 1,000 years ago was a professor would sit by a pillar in the mosque and teach, and the students would gather around, and that pillar would take on the name of the subject matter that the professor was teaching. Gradually, he got onto a cushion through the years and gradually into a chair with 4 legs, and the chair kept getting higher and higher. But I used the 4 legs in this book to describe our teaching in Islamic studies at that time. And the first leg represented Islam as Muslim scholars understand it. The second leg represented scholars who might not be Muslims, but were not bound by Muslim theology, but were just trying to find out what really happened historically and what the early beliefs were. The third leg represented what is we often call folk Islam or popular Muslim piety, and that is the practice of many Muslims, which is a mixture often from animism and other things, a belief in spirits, the wearing of amulets, and things of that nature. And then the fourth leg is Christian witness. How do we approach Muslims in light of this background we have looked at? Now, I changed the legs, or the legs have been changed a little bit recently by the leaders of the Islamic program. So we now say the first leg is the leg of the great texts of Islam. The second leg is what we can learn through the behavioral sciences, which would include things like folk Islam. The third leg is what is a biblical perspective on Islam. And the fourth leg then is how does this affect our witness?
That's really fascinating, Dr. Woodberry. So, what challenges did you face in your 50 years ministry engaging with the Muslim world?
The challenges were different in each place. My first encounter with Muslims was in Beirut, Lebanon, where I was dealing with scholars for the most part. I was very much in a learning mode, but my roommate in the second year was a Lebanese person. So I was in firsthand contact, but I was in contact with the educated Muslims in a country which had a large Christian presence as well. We then were assigned to Pakistan, where I worked in the Christian Study Center, and we interacted with the Islamic Research Institute, which was the government agency for making sure that the laws of Pakistan conformed to Islam. So there I worked with educated Islamic scholars on one hand, but then in the village and on the street and so forth, I encountered the world of folk Islam with the wearing of amulets and things of that nature, magic, all kinds of magic mixed in with Islam. But still there was a significant Christian presence there, so there was a greater freedom. Then when we went to Afghanistan, although my assignment was to be the second pastor allowed in that country in 100 years, nevertheless, there were great restrictions there, but I also encountered a great deal more of folk Islam. And then it gave me the opportunity to interact with the government. For example, the first day we were there, 3 missionaries had come into the country. They gave out 3 Gospels of Luke. They were put under arrest for that. And so I had an opportunity to find a Muslim lawyer, give him a defense based totally on the Quran, and win the court case through this Islamic lawyer. Then we moved to Saudi Arabia, and there it was a country even more closed to Christians than Afghanistan had been.
That's a remarkable story, Dr. Woodberry. You have been in Pakistan, in my home country, and then you went to Afghanistan. And then God opened door for you to enter in Saudi Arabia, in a more closed country. What was your experience over there?
Well, this was the first time that the Saudis had allowed a resident pastor in the capital, in the central part of the country. And I was supposed to work basically with non-Saudis and non-Muslims. We had many Arabs from Egypt and Lebanon, and we had Pakistanis and others there. So we had many countries represented that could come to church, but the Saudis, the Muslims, were not allowed to accept at funerals. And we were supposed to keep low profile. Well, we just kept growing so big that it was hard to be low profile. And so the government said we couldn't meet anymore. And so I found some letters that were written are attributed to Muhammad, allowing the Christians of Najran in Arabia to worship. And so I gave these to various people interacting with the government, and if Muhammad allowed worship, as long as they were loyal citizens, paid the tax, and in times of war provided certain things to the government, why should this not be the case today? And so they allowed it. Later, when I went back, they were having trouble. The church was having trouble again. And so they said, well, can you get this in Arabic? So I went down to the library there and found the Arabic letters, which gave permissions for Christians to worship. And so once again, the government opened things up. And actually, King Khalid, who was king at the time, when I left, thanked me for my work.
That's a fascinating story, Dr. Woodberry. It's really inspirational. So my next question is it possible to have dialogue with Islam? Or do we need to narrow down according to the sectarian division of the Muslim world?
We always need to be aware of our audience. And we need to see how does the gospel meet the needs of that particular audience. Jesus spoke in a different way to different people that he encountered in Palestine, so that we gear the message, the part of the message that is relevant to each group. For example, tomorrow in La Cañada here, the Muslims of La Cañada, right next door to Pasadena, where we are, want to have a dialogue with some of us Christians to see how can we live together in harmony. And so they are looking for areas where we can cooperate, and there are plenty of areas where we can cooperate. And so just like Jesus said, of some you're not far from the kingdom, and of others you're like your father, the devil, there are different aspects of the biblical message that fit different aspects of Muslims. So we always try to see what in the gospel is going to be more relevant. And as Christians, we are interested both in being peacemakers. Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. And we are interested in evangelism, but respectful evangelism, because Jesus said to give the message to all people until he came again. And so we look for those aspects of the gospel that will be most relevant to the Muslims that we're talking with.
After post 9/11, Western world recognized the presence of extremist Islam in the world. And as it's estimated that in 2050, Muslim population and Christian population will be equal in the world. What is your advice to the church how to engage with their Muslim neighbors in 21st century?
Well, we need to realize two things here. One is many of the Muslims have come to the West in order to get away from some of the factional strife in their own country. And we have many Muslims here who want to be good neighbors, such as we'll be meeting with some of them in La Cañada tomorrow. At the same time, we are really realizing that with the terrorism, many Muslims are turning away from Islam. A book has been written called A Wind in the House of Islam, which looks at the movements to Christ among Muslims. And 82% of the Muslims to Christ among Muslims have happened in the first 12 years of this century. And they started really increasing in 1979 with the Khomeini revolution, so that we have greater hostility, but we have Muslims both who want other Muslims who want greater peace, and we have some Muslims who want something different than Islam. So we need to be prepared to be peacemakers with those who want peace and to offer the gospel of salvation to all Muslims, whether they're militants or peace-loving. So we have this sort of dual opportunity at the present time. And one interesting factor here, in the past, if you wanted to work with Muslims, you often had to go to a Muslim majority country overseas. Now, there are many Muslims here, and those who can't leave the United States can have plenty of opportunities to be good neighbors and to share love with Muslims.
So, Dr. Woodberry, it's really wonderful to know that you brought two wonderful ladies on this campus, Dr. Roberta King for ethnomusicology and Dr. Evelyn Rice-Sakhar for Islamic Studies Department. What do you think? What role music and art can play for peacemaking with Muslim neighborhood?
They can have a tremendous role because Muslims and Christians appreciate good music and appreciate good art. And our emotions get caught up in that, and we blend. Let me give an example from World War II, which wasn't with Muslims, but in the middle of a major battle between the Germans and the British and Americans, on Christmas Eve, although they had been fighting each other, one person began singing a Christmas carol, and then on the other side, they sang a Christmas carol, and they began singing in German and English together, and it was a bonding. The next day, they were fighting, but this was a bonding experience. Music and art can bring us together in a way where we appreciate each other. And then once we appreciate each other and have blended our hearts in this way, then it's easier to express some of the faith that we have much more easily.
Dr. Woodberry, it is such a privilege and honor to have a time with you, and we learn a lot through your wisdom and experience in Islamic world. And as you served in Pakistan, so I would like to say, Aapka bahut bahut shukriya.
And I, in response, would say bahut bahut shukriya for allowing me to share.
God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you.